Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Intruder Break-In with My Cousin by Angel. This happened to me when I was 14, or rather should say this happened to us. If you were to ask how many times my cousin's parents bounced from house to house, he would probably just shrug his shoulders. That's how often his parents would move. Sometimes it would be houses, sometimes even apartments. Yeah, I do miss the times when he did live in apartments, as whenever we would play hide and seek with our other closest cousin, it would definitely be more exciting than just playing with some random kids from the apartment complex. Anyway, that's not important to the story. His parents were always a little bit weird, always constantly moving and leaving for business trips. That's how they could afford to move from place to place. But if you were to ask me what his parents did for a living, I literally have no idea, because I barely talked to them. And if I ever did, it was at parties they threw. But you know how that goes. The only thing I do know is that his dad was a contractor. That's literally about it. I remember this day like I know the back of my hand. It was hot as hell, like almost 100 degrees. It felt more like 110, but it wasn't anything really bad. I used to always have sleepovers at his house whenever I could get the chance, and that day it was no different, or so I thought. I arrived at his house in the early hours of the afternoon, and as expected, his parents were away on a business trip. We opened some of the windows so we could let the hot air out, and granted this probably didn't help our case at all, and most likely even made it worse. We turned on each fan to max blast and went upstairs to play video games on his Xbox. We played for about an hour or two, and eventually we both got hungry. We agreed to go to this spot that was a 10-minute drive from his house. So we got dressed, and before we left, we closed some of the windows. That way, if anybody were to drive by or walk by, they couldn't just hop through the window if they were so inclined. The irony while writing this still hits me like a brick. We got in my car and drove to the spot we agreed to get food at. I say my car because my mother trusted me enough to let me drive one of her spare cars. As bad as that sounds, she trusted me enough on the road by myself. I mean, she knew that I would never jeopardize my life or even remotely drive recklessly. Anyway, we ordered our food and quickly headed back home to avoid traffic. When we got there, we sat in the living room and watched YouTube or whatnot while we ate our food. So we sat there for about a good hour or two before we headed back upstairs to his room. Around 7 or 8, we closed each window as it was getting dark out, and I'll cut out the rest of the small details as you can use your imagination of what teenagers our age were doing. I got thirsty and decided to go downstairs to get a cup of water before I decided to go to bed. It was around 10 at that point, and I was getting tired, so I quickly filled up my cup and headed back up the stairs. My cousin was already in bed scrolling through social media, but shortly after, he rolled on his side and fell asleep. Suddenly, I couldn't fall asleep because of how incredibly hot it was. But after 10 minutes of rolling around and flipping the pillow, eventually I did fall asleep. When I woke up sometime later, I checked my phone and it was 1 a.m. I'm not sure what woke me up, but something did wake me up. I rubbed my eyes and took a sip of water, and now that I was aware and awake, I heard it. Footsteps moving around downstairs. At first I chalked it up to his parents coming back early from their business trip, but the footsteps kept pacing between one place. Then I heard drawers being opened and rummaged through, then footsteps going between the living room and guest bedrooms downstairs. I walked over to my cousin and shook him awake, and he groggily said, "What?" And I asked him, "Are your parents supposed to be home?" His head snapped to look at me, and he said, "No, they're not supposed to be back until Tuesday." This made my heart skip a beat. I quickly tiptoed to the door and locked it. Just as I was about to walk away from the door, I heard footsteps coming slowly up the stairs as if whoever it was trying to be quiet. I know my cousin heard it too, because as soon as I turned my head to look in his direction, he was already quietly running to the window to unlock it. We were trying to lift it up, but the piece of shit was so old it wouldn't budge. We were grunting as quietly as we could, struggling to get this window open, but it wasn't quite enough. We heard the doorknob trying to be turned. Thankfully, it was locked. I think that angered the person on the other side, because when he found that the door wouldn't budge, he started kicking it and ramming into it. Now our clock was ticking and adrenaline kicked in. We finally got the window open and I yelled at my cousin, "Anthony, go!" And he leapt down into the grass. Then it was my turn. I peeked my head over the edge and saw the fall. It had to have been 10 or 20 feet. Suddenly, I heard the door behind me being busted open, and I didn't think twice and just threw myself out the window. I landed on my right arm and my backside. When I looked up, I saw a man with long, messy hair and his eyes wide, looking right at me from the window. We quickly got up and bolted to the neighbor's house where we used their phone to call 911. The police showed up a few minutes later and investigated the house, and they searched every room and every hiding place there could be. But the guy was nowhere to be found. He was already long gone. Later, I found out from paramedics I had sprained my collarbone and a bicep. Luckily nothing too serious. After that, the police took information regarding what had happened and took a description of the guy. They said they would contact us if anything ever came up, but we never got a call back. I didn't tell my mom about the incident in fear of never getting allowed to sleep over at Anthony's house again, but I told her that I fell from a very high rock and landed on my side. She did take me to a doctor because I complained about the pain in my shoulder, and that's how I found out what had happened to me. Me and my cousin both assumed that when we left to go get food or whenever we went upstairs before we closed the windows, this guy just simply climbed through and then hid in the basement, waiting until we fell asleep, to rob us or maybe even worse. We rarely even talk about it anymore, but whenever we bring it up, we both laugh at it. I don't think the man was ever caught, but I just hope he doesn't do anything bad to anyone else like he could have done to us. The Silent Passenger by Whiskers and Floof. I'm still trying to suss out what I had experienced and if it was all just in my head. Somehow spooked from an event I attended last night. I've always had a cursory interest in the occult. I was raised in a Wiccan household, although I'm staunchly agnostic today. Still, I enjoy hearing stories about old things and places purportedly haunted. I like ghost hunting and getting spooked, and I'm also a scientist and tend to approach things in a rather pragmatic manner, picking apart whatever I'm experiencing through an objective lens. That said, I'm rather intuitive, so when I get a weird feeling, I don't immediately brush it off. Instead, I sit with it to better understand what it is I'm observing. Last night, I attended a haunted objects presentation by Greg and Dana Newkirk at the Stanley Hotel. If you don't know who these folks are, they've been around for 20 or 30 years in some capacity online hunting for ghosts and cryptids. More recently, they've specialized in showcasing their collection of so-called haunted objects, and the presentation was about how our human experience, storytelling, and personification of objects in a way creates the ghosts that we see. Greg aptly stated that we are all ghost machines, and that often when we experience something, that something is showing us an aspect of ourselves. They specifically highlighted objects as vessels, whereby if people infuse vibes into an object, weird things could happen. They even invited us to do so with several of their objects on display. Overall, it was a fantastic showcase, and the couples were excellent storytellers. I highly recommend attending one of their events. After the presentation and meet and greet, I took a gander at a few of the haunted objects with the friend that I'd brought, and then we left. I had a distinct feeling that I was forgetting something back in the building as we walked to my car, and my friend and I joked that we must have given something to the objects we were staring at. I dropped my friend off at their house, and we chatted for a bit before I said my goodbyes. I live in Denver, so it was an hour-and-a-half drive back down a winding road at night to get home. I should note that I was not particularly spooked by the event. I was entertained and intrigued, but not scared like going to a scary movie where your senses are piqued. Upon re-entering my car, though, I could distinctly feel that I was not alone. I peered into my back seat and then into my rearview mirror and saw nothing. Still, I had this overwhelming feeling that something was there, and that if I focused too hard on trying to see it, I was going to scare myself. When I've had these weird feelings in the past, I would usually pause to confirm them, and then try to diffuse my discomfort by talking into the empty space, even though I am probably alone. So, I did that. I commanded this presence to leave. I then waited, inspecting the rearview mirror as I started the car. The feeling I had didn't leave, though. Instead, it just lingered in between the two rear seats. I didn't want to get out of the car, and I knew I had a long drive, so I just told the space not to mess with me and started to drive. The feeling of this presence remained, and by the time I was getting onto the SD Parkway down to Lyons, I was getting increasingly uncomfortable. Like, if I looked too carefully into the blackness of my rearview mirror, I would see something. So, to settle my nerves, I moved my purse to the middle console and invited whatever it was to sit in the passenger seat. Because, why not? I can't adequately explain how weird this felt. It was like my entire right side of my face was burning, and every time I looked over, while I couldn't see anything visibly, I could sense I was looking at something, and that it was looking back. I had this overwhelming sense inside to just focus on the road. It was pitch black in the mountains at night, and I was worried I might run into some wildlife. I turned on some music and started to sing along with the songs as I went down the winding road. Every time I got distracted, I had this urge, almost like an internal command to watch the road and to be careful. This continued until I reached Lyons, about 20 or 30 minutes. As I turned onto 36 South towards Boulder, I just asked the space if it intended to stay with me the entire ride home, which I wasn't too pleased about. Of course, there wasn't a response, but about a mile or two down 36 South, I felt this really sharp shock to the back of my skull. It felt like I was electrocuted, and it freaked me out. That was when I noticed several rotating lights of a cop car up on the road. I assumed someone had been pulled over, but since it was a 2-lane road and pitch black, I slowed down a bit. By the time I got to the scene, I realized it was actually an accident so fresh that the ambulance had yet to arrive. The cops were directing southbound traffic to turn around, and it was at that moment I realized that the accident was likely a fatality. As I was turning around, I looked out my passenger window past the presence that was lingering in that seat for the entire drive, and I saw a person lying in the road. I got the overwhelming urge to say, "Go save them." And I kid you not, just like that, the presence that I had felt was gone. I turned around and found a place to pull off. I still had an hour drive home and was sufficiently spooked. I don't know what happened. I honestly am half convinced I just imagined it all. In my mind's eye, I was envisioning this passenger as a small figure, a dull gray in color and what I could only describe as husk-like. It had dreadlock-like hair and orbits for eyes. It was super eerie to think about. I haven't had a feeling like that in years, and I don't know what it was, or why it was there, or why it would disappear when I encountered the accident. I managed to get home just fine, but I didn't sleep well last night, and I'm pondering if I just have an overactive imagination. Anyone else ever experienced something like this? Any thoughts? If I'm just crazy? Creepy Cult by Ivyall16. When I was younger, I used to sneak out from my parents all the time during the night since I was grounded a lot. I remember I met up with a boy. Nothing romantic. We walked to a park that's quite far down a long road opposite my house, until we got to a well-known woods area that had a park right in front of it. But if you worked a little bit further, there was another little park next to some stables. Of course, being about 2 a.m. and there being no streetlights in this woods or park, it was extremely dark. I was about 17, so I acted brave and went through with it. The boy and I walked through and went and sat on the swings on this little park that overlooked the field that entered the woods, just gossiping and doing whatever a youngster does these days. Anyway, I can't remember how long it was until this happened, but about 8 people with cloaks, yes, cloaks, started walking through the field with lanterns. Not flashlights, lanterns. I couldn't quite see what they looked like, but they sounded just like a group of older kids with the way they talked. But with cloaks and lanterns? It made me go cold. At that point, I was scared. But at least they couldn't see us, as we had no light and we just sat there on these swings in silence, watching in awe. We watched as they walked along the field and entered the woods on the other side. It was such a relief to watch them leave. I mean, what if they'd seen us? Me and the boy sat gossiping about what we had just seen. It was the strangest thing ever. Until about 10 minutes later, we heard absolutely terrifying screams coming from the woods that sounded like a much older woman than any of the people we saw. It wasn't as if the scream was a playful scream, or even, like I said, a scream of one of the people that we had seen walking, as it sounded like an elderly woman. The screaming went on for about 10 minutes, and I considered calling the police, but the boy I was with didn't want us to get involved. I thought, sod that, I'm calling them. However, within that instant, the screaming stopped. There was nothing. Complete silence. You bet your arse we were out of there. There were no sightings or nothing was heard of what happened that night, but their screams haunted me for a good couple of years after. Nobody had been killed or no bodies discovered. The woods isn't majorly big, so it's not as if a body was just left there without being discovered. It was almost like a dream, although it wasn't. And it was never brought up again. Me and the boy didn't end up speaking on it. I can't even remember who it was. Weird. Keep Your Rent Money by CatLady1995. I'm a property manager and 1 year postpartum, so I returned to my company part-time. It was fun because I got to float around to different apartment communities who needed help and just help where needed. In September, I helped at a property about an hour from my house. It was a bit of a drive, but it was a fairly small property with relatively no big problems, so easy money for the day. I was covering for a manager who was out on vacation, and of course it was the dreaded 6th of the month. That meant I was handing out late letters and making calls, unfortunately. Definitely not my favorite part of the job, but it is necessary. The one thing I hate about floating is the residents don't know me so well, so I'd be delivering late letters and calling and they didn't even know me. Again, not my favorite part of the job, but it has to be done. So, here we go. I had about 10 late letters to deliver. All was going normal and fine, and some people answered the door and said, "Yep, sorry, I'll have it paid on such and such date." Another person didn't answer, so I left the info on the door, but they flipped me off as I was walking away. I mean, all pretty normal stuff that comes with the job. I got down to about the 7th or 8th person. I walked up to this apartment, and I could tell from the outside that the occupants have absolutely destroyed the home. I smelled cigarettes, cat urine, and general mustiness before I even knocked. All the blinds were broken. There were blankets up in the windows. I mean, the works. I got up to the door and did my normal quick knock. Waited about 5 seconds and was ready to post notice to the door. Right as I was folding it up to put it between the door partly swung open. A gentleman wearing just his boxers with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth opened the door, but didn't unlatch the security lock, so the door wasn't open all the way. "What do you want?" he said, giving me a death glare, but also looking me up and down inappropriately at the same time. I explained that I was just there to deliver the late letters and that I would be on my way. As I was explaining this, I noticed that he kept looking over his shoulder, as if someone was standing next to him behind the door. I found that odd, as if someone was hiding from me, especially because this gentleman wouldn't open the door all the way. I heard some whispering, and now I was sure that he was communicating with someone. The gentleman in the doorway asked me to wait and said he had things in his apartment that he needed looked at. I explained that I was just there for the letter, but that he could send photos into the office and that I would get work orders in. He began complaining about our maintenance team and stated that he really wanted someone to take a look at this stuff in person. At that point, I was feeling really uneasy. Typically, I would enter and help no problem. But between the looks this guy was giving me and creepy who knows who behind the door, I just wasn't feeling safe at that point. I deferred again, trying to make myself sound unimportant, and just said that I was a floating person. I couldn't do anything without manager approval when she was away, so there really was no point. But then, something caught my eye upstairs. I saw a window blind move, and I noticed 2 additional guys upstairs who were now both staring down at me. I was so uneasy, I thought I was going to be sick at that point. I told the gentleman that I wouldn't be entering without maintenance or the property manager present, due to it being an ongoing maintenance concern, and that there wasn't much I could personally do. He looked annoyed and finally slammed the door in my face. I went back to the office and grabbed the maintenance supervisor for the property to chat things over regarding that encounter. The maintenance supervisor explained to me that there used to be an old man who lived in that apartment, but then his son took over the lease after he died. He told me that he'd noticed a lot of strange activity in individuals around that home since the father died, but he hadn't personally witnessed anything illegal yet, so he just let it go. He explained that they planned to make the people move when the contract was over, due to the condition of the home by itself anyway. While I can't prove something horrible was going to happen if I entered the premises, that by far is the creepiest encounter I've had in property management in 7 years. Camping Incident by Gabagool 245. Me and my best friend try to go camping once a year. We've been doing this since we were 13 years old. Never really truly been scared or had anything weird happen until last year in the Blue Ridge Mountains. We showed up the first night of peak season, and space was very limited. We were losing light, so we set up camp on a spot on the side of the mountain that was an absolute wind tunnel. Morning came, so we went into town, drank beers, and dicked around until late afternoon. By the time we got back up to the mountains to switch our camping spot, we were losing light again, but managed to find a more remote spot. We got set up with our tents, got a fire going, and started drinking again. Time passed. It was probably around 1 a.m. when we saw a flashlight aimed at us. And then it started walking our way. We didn't really think too much of it and assumed that it was likely a park ranger coming to fuss at us about something because, who else walks up on you in a remote part of the mountains at 1 a.m.? I don't know about you, but ever since I started camping, I learned it's kind of an unspoken rule that you don't walk up to someone camping late at night unless it's an emergency. Anyway, the person got close enough and we realized it was just some guy, probably in his early 50s. He was wearing a shirt and basketball shorts, and his girl, who was in her 40s, was avoiding eye contact with us. The man immediately forced a conversation about nothing, and didn't acknowledge the time or his girl. His eyes were darting all over the place while we were talking to him about dumb shit like what model or style of lantern we had, and how cool it was. He was saying weird stuff like how he used to be a former law enforcement officer, and it was completely out of context of the random conversation he had engaged us in when all of a sudden he pretended to land his flashlight on our tents and said, "Oh, that's where you guys are sleeping, huh? Cool setup." The way his eyes and flashlight were moving gave us both the feeling that he was trying to see how many of us were out there and what we had on us or near us, because his eyes and flashlight kept scanning the ground around us. We were getting sized up, but for what? I don't know. Once the guy saw everything around us, he kind of paused for a minute, ended the conversation, and then just walked off into the woods. When his flashlight disappeared, me and my friend looked at each other, and without me saying anything, he looked at me and said, "We're packing our shit and getting out of here." And that's what we did. That was definitely the most unsettling thing I have ever had while camping. I think the guy was going to wait until we were asleep and come back. I just don't know for what, but I do know we were 100% getting sized up that night. It might not seem like much, but if you've ever had a moment with another human being sizing you up, you know what I'm talking about. Creepy Hike in Northwest Georgia by Abortificant Art Print. I attended college in Northwest Georgia. The school had a campus of 27,000 acres for about 2,000 students. So as you can imagine, it was mostly fields and woodlands. My senior year, the school was short on housing for women and asked for female volunteers to move into apartments on a remote part of the campus. They had been built back in the 1930s to house workers for the school dairy and were a couple of miles from the main part of campus. The apartment complex was small, maybe 8 units, and it sat atop a hill with lovely views and had access to hiking trails. Plus, if you visited another school to drink wine or have boys stay over, you'd be expelled. So this added privacy was a huge bonus. My roommate Ella and I quickly signed up. Ella and I liked walking the trails in the evenings and usually headed back to our place just before sunset. Like most colleges, ours came with its fair share of ghost stories and tales of cryptids, but the woods had always been peaceful on our walks. Anyway, we were together, so we felt safe. One evening in late spring, we headed down a trail that veered further from the main road than the route we usually took. We walked along as usual, chatting and being silly. And as we walked, the woods seemed to grow dark much quicker than usual. We were unfamiliar with the sunset times, and it seemed far too early to be losing light. I told myself we had been mistaken about the time, or that I was just imagining it. The trail was well worn, so even if it got dark, we'd be able to find our way back to the road easily. Then something started feeling off. I don't really know how else to explain it. It felt as if very suddenly we weren't safe and that we were being watched. Ella and I are both really talkative, so I knew she must be feeling something weird as well because neither of us was saying much as we walked. Anyone who's been to Georgia in warm months knows the woods here are loud. The cicadas alone can be deafening. At the start of our walk, we heard bugs and birds all around us, and I don't know when it began, but I realized that the sound of insects had faded away, and the woods around us had fallen silent. I kept walking because I didn't want to give in to an overactive imagination, but the sound of each step I took seemed to blast through the trees, announcing our presence. I want to say that I began to hear a rumble in the trees around us, but that isn't exactly true. I didn't hear anything, but the sense of something angry and threatening seemed close in on all sides. The air felt heavy and close, and I felt like I was going crazy, because there was literally nothing happening that should have been causing me to feel that way. It was just absolute dread. I forced my feet forward because I felt certain I was overreacting, but my skin prickled anyway. I jumped when Ella broke the silence by saying, do you want to turn around? Yeah, I said without hesitating and spun on my heel. As I took my first step back toward the trailhead, I felt a sharp yank. Something had pulled the hood off my jacket so hard that it fell halfway down my back and was at my elbows. Without speaking, Ella and I immediately bolted. We ran until we couldn't breathe. I was too scared to look back, but I felt eyes trained on us. We made it home and locked the doors. No clue what happened out there, but I will say that that was our last hiking venture. Someone Impersonated My Sister by Alba Michelle. Last year, I started law school in Los Angeles. I had never lived in a big city before, and I was really excited to be in a massive city with over 4 million people. Ever since I was little, I always knew I had a half-sister in LA, but my parents had this weird anger towards her that always made it feel like a taboo topic. Of course, I had looked her up on social media, and I knew what she looked like, but that was about it. We'd never actually met. She was never that active on social media, so there wasn't a lot I could see. Out of nowhere, one day in my first year of law school, I got a friend request on Facebook from my sister. Her profile seemed legitimate, she had Facebook friends, and her profile picture looked like her. She sent me a message inviting me to a little dinner party at the park with her friends. We could finally meet each other for the first time. I was new to LA, and still am. I had no idea which parts of the cities to avoid at night. But I was excited about this idea, but I did have some anxiety about it too. It would be nice if we met, totally clicked, and became besties for life. But what if we ended up sobbing like we were in some dramatic movie scene? What if I tried to talk to her and she just didn't click with me? Or she started showing me an attitude? Or even worse, what if it was all going well until we had some kind of disagreement, someone saying something hurtful, and then we were both crying in front of everyone? Honestly, if she had suggested a cozy little bakery for desserts instead, I would have gone. But going to a park with other people didn't feel right. I thought it was like such a precious moment that I didn't want to have it in front of all these other people. I couldn't bring myself to go. I didn't want to risk having a meltdown in front of other people. I was worried about how messy it could get. A few weeks later, I Googled that park just to see what it was like. Maybe we could meet up there together just one-on-one. And that's when I learned something was wrong. I won't say the name of the park, but anyone who has lived in LA for long will tell you that it's not a safe place for girls to be having a dinner party at night. The area surrounding the park has very high violent crime rates, and it's controlled by gangs. Even people who do illegal business in that park are forced to pay a tax to the gang in exchange for being left alone. So now I was really concerned and curious. I actually tried to get a hold of my sister myself. She was an undergrad at the time in a local college. I had a friend who went to her school, and I asked my friend to reach out to her on campus and ask her if she'd be okay with meeting us. They connected, and the three of us met at my friend's house. It was great. We got along so well. My friend was also very happy to do that for us, the three of us had so much fun. We weren't bursting into tears, but we let out a few. We had dinner, we watched a movie, and we spent the night at my friend's house. When I told my sister about the whole incident with the park and the dinner party, she said she hadn't used Facebook since high school, so clearly someone was impersonating her. I would have told her to report the fake account, but it had already been deleted. She knew she had been impersonated on social media, though. Another one of her friends had been scammed by someone pretending to be her. It was some scheme involving fake concert tickets or something like that. So someone had been impersonating my sister. They knew I was in town, and they literally tried to lure me into one of the most dangerous parts of LA at night. I have no idea what their motives were. I don't even know if I want to find out. But meeting my sister after all these years was a beautiful thing. Everything else surrounding it was terrifying. Uncle Josh note, trying not to comment on all these stories, but this one just bothers me. The fact that someone is impersonating your sister is one thing. The fact that they knew you were in town is pretty messed up. I'm glad you're okay, but a lot of friggin' weirdos out there. I guess that's why I say it at the end of every podcast. Could be anybody. Everybody stay safe out there online. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on this channel or the podcast, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Looking for your scary Halloween or fall stories for the annual Halloween extravaganza coming up pretty quick, and so far I've got some pretty intense ones. Hopefully, you'll share yours. Email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. If you would be so kind, please like this video, consider becoming a subscriber to the channel, and share it with your friends. Leave a comment down below, let me know what you thought of the stories, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Follow me on social media, you know the drill, and if you'd like to take your support of the channel a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description, and also check out my storefront at tpublic.com. Get yourself some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.